Let's talk about the texture node in Ventuz today. Like always, I jump to a new scene. I change my logic layout. You can find the texture node under the toolbox and in the tab texture. And down here, you can find the texture. So let me drop one in. Texture. If I bring in here texture, we can't see anything because the texture or material or whatever in Ventuz have to be applied to a geometry in Ventuz. To do that, I simply bring in a rectangle, and then you can see already our little rectangle with that default black and white pattern. Let's make it larger. Let's make that maybe 20 by 20. And as you can see, now we have our texture applied to our rectangle. If I select my texture node here, then you can see immediately, okay, it is actually not a texture node, it is a material node. Yeah, so that means Ventuz is using that material node for different predefined nodes, right? So for example, if we select here our color, right, and we put here a solid color inside, then you can see this is as well a material node. I also talked about that material in a previous tutorial, so please feel free to check that out as well. Okay, so let's talk about textures. As you can see, we have here our material stage, and this material can have different pre-configurations. We can also delete this material stage, and we can add more. We even can add multiple to layer textures above each other, which I will show you in this tutorial. So let's select this texture node, and by default, you remember this is exactly that pre-configured texture node what we brought in before. If we click here, this little arrow, then we can switch between different options, right? So textures, we have the default, which we choose now, a base and alpha, decal, opacity, alpha, and so on, right? I won't talk about all of them today because most of them are very self-explanatory, okay? So I simply use now here my default. If I want to change, for example, the texture, most of the time you basically want to change your or use your own texture, right? Then you simply open this little arrow, and then down here you can see the file, right? So if I click this little three dots, then I can choose here, for example, now my own graphic, my own texture, PNG, JPEG, DDS, whatever SVG you want to load. As you can see now, this texture is not in the correct aspect ratio because Ventuz is evenly applying it to our 1:1 rectangle, okay? Aspect ratio 1:1. But let's say we simply could go now to our geometry and adjust it here, right? So that we get the correct aspect ratio of our texture. But sometimes you don't want to have that. Sometimes you really want to keep your base geometry, circle, cubes, rectangle in the original size. But we need to find a way to change the scaling of these textures, right? To do that, we go back here to our material, we go to our loader, we go to our texture, right? And down here, we can see we have here that mapping now, right? If we open up that mapping, for example, then it's set by default to simple. If we change that here to 2D and UV0, then we have here access to much more options. Yeah, these options are now we can move our logo into the position X and Y, we can scale it in X and Y, and so on. So you see already we find exactly the correct properties what we want to have. Now you may wonder, hey, where can I find out what is the resolution of my loaded texture, right? So my Ventuz logo, what is that resolution? Of course, you simply can go into your file browser, onto properties, details, find it out manually, but of course we also can do that with Ventuz. To do that with Ventuz, we simply have to change here our texture loader to texture property. And down here, we change it to our texture loader because that's what we are talking about right now. And as you can see immediately, we changed already here something in our mapping. So this looks a little bit awkward, right? So before we fix that, let's bring that back to default. And as you also can see, once we change that to that texture property to a texture loader, Ventuz creates here a texture loader for us, right? And loads that texture into our material, okay? So in this texture loader, in the outputs, you can see now exactly what we are looking for, and that's the resolution of our loaded texture. Of course, because we created a new texture loader now, so Ventuz used the default texture, I have to load my Ventuz logo here again. Simply let's do that. And now we can see Ventuz tells us here exactly the width and the height in pixels of our Ventuz logo. So as we know now the width and height in pixels, we simply can go here back to our mapping and we can adjust here the scaling. Let's make the scaling 1.932 and the Scaling Y was 0.5. What was that exactly? Let me check again. That was 0.597. So 0.6 basically, 0.597, right? And now we have exactly the perfect aspect ratio of our logo. Of course, it's now, because the scaling X is larger than 1, so we have to bring down our scaling factor all that it fits nicely here onto our rectangle, okay? As you also can see, we have here now white and here it's black, right? This is because we're still using the inherited lighting model from Ventuz. That means Ventuz is using it as a material and is affected by the default scene light, which is directly in front of us, right? So to change that, if you want to have even colors, simply change here the lighting model to no light. And now we can see we have here a nice black and white logo. I also turn on the bounding box, just that you can see that we are still working here on our rectangle, right, on our 20 by 20 rectangle. Let's talk about a sampler now. Let's say I want to have that Ventuz, doesn't matter how small I make that logo, is wrapping it, right? So right now, by default, it's doing a simple clap, right? But let's say I want to do a simple wrap. If I change that sampler to simple wrap, then you can see, if I play now here with our, in the mapping with our scaling factor, then Ventuz is doing basically that repetition of our texture based on our scaling factors, okay? So next thing what we also can do, let's say, let's maybe add here quickly another layer, a backdrop, just a gradient, simple backdrop. And let's bring that in the background. Let's say I want to use this as a kind of a little logo down here, right? So to do that, of course, we could add here axis. And let's say, let's bring that somewhere down there. Let's make it a bit smaller. And let's maybe bring that down here. But let's say, hey, I don't like these sharp edges. Let me turn off the bounding box again. I don't like the sharp edges. Let's say you want to have some soft edges around here, right? So what we can do, like I said at the beginning, we simply can layer or stack textures above each other. So what I want to do now, I want to get a kind of a nice soft edge here. So at the material stage, it's a texture with a base and alpha. And down here in our texture, I selected this one. I don't want to have the black and white pattern. I want to have, for example, that blurred rectangle, right? I also don't like this too much, so let's make it maybe into a circle. Let's use maybe this one. And here I say, this is cool, this is what I like. And of course, now you can play around again here with your scaling, because I want to have it a bit larger, you know, that we have really that nice Ventuz logo down there, okay? So these are the basics, how you can use and change properties of textures, of images on your geometries, right? Let me add another one. Let me add another rectangle here. Let's use this one and let's put another texture here in front. And let's also make this guy a bit larger. Let's also make it 20 by 20. And again, let's jump to our material. And down here, we change our texture. We change that. No, we don't change it. We delete it actually, and we create a new one. Because at the same time, as add-on, I also will quickly show you about normal maps, which actually work exactly same like textures. We simply can use our default normal map. And as you can see now, it looks like we have now basically transformed our flat rectangle into a 3D object, which we actually did not, because we're simply using a normal map, right? So if I move that here, and if I bring it, then you can see it really looks like we have that shadows. It's for sure affected by light, but it's just a normal map. So we did not really change the geometry, okay? And here the same. For example, let's go back to our mapping of our normal map, and let's go down here to the mapping, change that to 2D mapping UV0. And if we want to have, for example, a little bit a smoother, smaller, finer roughness texture, right, or normal map texture, then you can see we get here now a little bit that issues with that basically stretched pixels, right? To fix that, we simply have to go back to our sampler and change that from simple down here to simple wrap. And now Ventuz is basically repeating the texture nicely, okay? We also can change colors, yeah? If we simply change the lighting model from inherit to base color, we simply change now the color here. For example, if we want to have kind of a more darkish or reddish or brownish wall, right, then we can do that like this. And here we have now our nice little normal map with that nice wall structure.